So this is a second part of a conversation about IR Crash Course History, where we sort of look at major processes that have remade the international system over vast swaths of human history. And this conversation about nations and the rise of the nation state really dovetails with the conversation about popular sovereignty, where we're trying to sort of explain the process by which that European map got sort of reshuffled from something that involves sort of corporate holdings between powerful families to something that looks more or less like what we see today, territorially contiguous states. And in order to explain that, we really need to sort of set up this idea of nations. So we use nations oftentimes casually to sort of refer to states or countries, but social scientists sort of use it slightly differently and will refer to nations as peoples, groups of people with a common identity who aspire to control themselves politically. And that second piece there is really important, right? So a common identity can be shared across many groups, but the idea is that that common identity should be the foundation for sort of political order, that needs to be woven into your politics in some sort of way. And again, this sort of fits with that idea of popular sovereignty, of people starting to conceptualize themselves as part of a political community. And so once you sort of start going down that road of saying, this is my political community, and we ought to be able to control our political destiny, oftentimes that sort of snowballs into the creation of a nation state, of trying to get the borders of a state, of a sovereign entity to correspond with where your group is at. That's actually a really difficult thing to do because people aren't situated in nice and tidy little pockets of land. People have moved around historically. And so while we do have some states that have managed to build a nation state, whether we're talking about Germany, which sort of has this sort of Germanic identity, or France, which maybe is built around sort of a linguistic and cultural identity, or Japan, which is, sort of benefits from the fact that it's an island, which makes it more or less easier to sort of say these are the boundaries of our community, or the United States, which built its national identity around sort of a civic idea of commitment to a constitution and to the rule of law and to a process, and anybody who sort of is willing to commit themselves to the Constitution and to that process is able to be part of that political community, right? So you have nation states emerging in a variety of different ways and expressing that idea of identity in many different ways. But we also have a lot of multinational states, countries where they looked at the population and realized there was no way to get the borders of the country to line up with the identity groups. And maybe that's not even a desirable thing. So we could look at Canada, where you have sort of your English-speaking Anglo-Canadians, and you have your sort of French-speaking Quebecois Canadians, and both groups have expressed a desire sort of for political control and identity to be sort of recognized politically. And they figured out how to make that more or less work, right? So signs are in English and French, and English children learn, English-speaking children learn French, and there's sort of a recognition that these two groups are going to share the country and share the sovereign entity. Other situations where we see this multi-ethnic, multinational sort of clustering: India, Belgium, Yugoslavia. Some of these are very successful examples of multiple groups living together and sharing a state system. Others, Yugoslavia, didn't work out, broke apart because those national pressures for voice and independence and autonomy for national groups was just too great. So when we talk about sort of the spread of this idea of nationalism and this creation of a nation state, I think it's important to sort of build in maybe two processes. One of them I have a slide for, and one of them I don't. So the process I don't have a slide for is really the role of the printing press. And Benedict Anderson has been really effective in laying out the power of the printing press and the creation of newspapers as a way of sort of fostering a sense of imagined communities, right? That you start reading about what's happening to people who are, far away, that you'll never meet. And as you read about those people, you start imagining them as being similar to you and like you in some way. And so he argues that sort of a lot of nationalism is linked to language, that people start imagining their political community as the reach of my newspaper, the reach of people that are reading this newspaper and participating in this conversation through editorials and outraged about the same things I am, that language sort of reshapes how we imagine who is like us and who's in our political community. And we see that process playing out across Europe, but I think it's insufficient to explain sort of the rewriting the map of Europe. And so I think one of the things that really helps us to understand sort of the transformative process that goes on with the rise of nationalism and of national identity is the French Revolution, right? And so with the French Revolution, you get this merging of popular sovereignty with nationalism. So the French people rise up, they overthrow the monarch, they declare themselves to be a people, they declare themselves to be sovereign, and they don't need the nobility to do that. And so they start, executing the nobility. Other countries freak out about this, particularly countries, that are run by nobles who see this as very dangerous, that people might rise up and execute the nobility. And so France is invaded and the French people mobilize. They arm themselves and organize into militaries and throw back the Habsburgs, one of the most powerful empires in Europe. And it suddenly becomes clear to everybody that a people fighting for their country, a people financing their country's war effort, is an incredibly powerful military innovation, and that the merging of nationalism of this is my political community with military force is far more effective than anything that you can marshal with mercenary armies. And as a result, the balance of power within Europe sort of shifts almost instantly, and France goes on the offensive and is able to conquer essentially all of Europe, subjugating or conquering or politically aligning itself with pretty much all of Europe. And as it goes out, as it conquers, it spreads these ideas that sovereignty doesn't need to be rooted in the nobles. Sovereignty doesn't need a king or a queen. Sovereignty is something that belongs to people. But also it spreads sort of a reactive element, right? And so as French armies are marching across Germanic states, German people recognize that while they don't necessarily need the nobility to have a political identity, their political identity doesn't necessarily include the French. And so you get this sort of reactive process playing out across Europe as people become aware not only of the potential of rethinking and reimagining their political community, but also the recognition that they don't want to be French and they're not part of that French community. And so as the French are sort of thrown back by a British and Russian-led alliance, the ideas that are sort of planted by that process and the transformations that we see in European politics are sort of the seeds have been planted, or the genie's out of the bottle. I don't know what metaphor you want to use, but we're going to see that playing out over the next century, over the 1800s, as two different processes play out. And I have the slide labeled Unification Movements, but that's not quite right? I mean, part of it is that there's this desire suddenly among people to sort of reimagine who's part of their political community, to reimagine what the borders of a state might look like, to reimagine how they might organize themselves into maybe linguistically coherent political entities that aren't, we've been joined to French or to Spanish speakers because that's who the Habsburgs happen to marry. And so we end up seeing two different mechanisms sort of playing out. One is unification, right? And so we see people who sort of imagine themselves as part of a political community that's much larger than the borders that they're currently tied to, sort of starting to advocate for and mobilize for some process to bind countries together into a more nationally coherent entity. And so we see this in Germany, we see this in Italy, and then we see this in Yugoslavia, where there's the creation of sort of this larger political entity. And I want to put a quick flag just what a massive project this is. And so this is Germany around the time of the 30 Years' War and the creation of the Treaty of Westphalia. The sort of outer sort of pinkish line is sort of the boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire. And you've got dozens, hundreds, scores of different Germanic states that potentially could share a common identity of sort of Germanic history and of that Holy Roman Empire, and sort of reshuffling those different kingdoms into a single coherent Germany is going to be a process that requires warfare and trade and railroads and political cunning. But at the core of all of it is this idea of nationalism. The second process that plays out is dissolution, that there are multi-ethnic or multinational empires, whether it's the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that are seeing people within them saying, we don't particularly want to be a part of this broader political entity. We would much rather see our own separate nation state emerge. And so you get separatist movements in the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire as different groups start trying to break free and are reorganized after the collapse of these empires. And so again, I think both of these processes, right, unification and dissolution, are central to creating the map that we see today. But at the core of both of those processes is nationalism and this desire for a coherent political entity that reflects how people imagine their political community.